Lady Miller-Melnick, who's going to introduce our keynote. Can I ask, first of all, we're trying to figure out room choreography. Can I have a show of hands for who is planning on attending the Michael Leitner Coexistence Project breakout session? Okay, very good. So now one or two other things. I want to remind you all at the end of the day to please, there'll be boxes for your name tags, and if you can leave those in the boxes, that would be much appreciated. What else? Dan Sohn? Evaluations. Thank you. Thank you. These evaluation sheets are really helpful to us, so if you would take a moment before the day is out and let us know where we've done good and where we can improve. And yes? I will ask him to speak slower. I'm guilty of the same thing. And apart from that, one more show for contributions. If you are inclined, we would be so grateful. There are pledge cards. Somebody asked me how you make out checks. The Israel Committee would be just perfect. And now let me turn you over to a co-founder of the Israel Committee, Lady Miller-Melnick.
Apparently now you can hear me, correct? Correct. Great. So it is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome you on behalf of the Israel Committee of Santa Barbara and to introduce our afternoon's keynote speaker, Dr. Josef Olmert. I know that some of you listened to his breakout session this morning. For those of you who didn't, I just want to give you a little bit of information about him before he comes up here to speak. He brings to the teaching a rare combination of talents. He's a Middle East scholar with a PhD from the internationally renowned London School of Economics. He's a former peace negotiator for Israel, and he's a much-published author and journalist. He served on the faculty of Tel Aviv University's Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies, where he headed the Syria and Lebanese desks. He also taught at Cornell University, at York University in Toronto, City College in New York, and at American University in Washington, D.C. He's currently an adjunct professor at the University of South Carolina. He's authored 3 books on the Middle East, as well as numerous articles in academic journals. But Dr. Olmert is not just an academic. He's going to speak to us today about the peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And he brings a wealth of practical knowledge and experience to this subject. He was a member of the Israeli delegation to peace talks with Syria, both at the Madrid Peace Conference and in the subsequent talks in Washington, D.C. In 1999, he was a policy advisor to former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ahrens, and in that capacity, he participated in official talks with then U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Defense Secretary William Cohen, as well as with numerous international counterparts of theirs. Since then, he's participated in many international conferences on the Middle East, and he maintains a good working relationship with a number of Arab and Palestinian diplomats. He's fluent in Arabic and English, as well as Hebrew, and he also has a command of both Russian and French, which served him well in this area. He's currently a regular columnist for the Huffington Post, a regular commentator on the Fox News channel. He's recognized as an expert on the Arab Spring, particularly with regard to Syria, and on Israel-Palestinian relations. So, yesterday's New York Times talked about, and I quote, the crisis that engulfed the ailing Middle East process this week. Well, headlines change from day to day, and context is therefore always important to our understanding of the issues. So we're fortunate today to have Dr. Olmert here to present his historical perspective on the peace negotiations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Josef Olmert.
Okay, as I said before, it's very difficult to be the second keynote speaker after the fascinating introduction by my good friend Alon Ben David. And now to stick again, I have to find out, what did I say already? I need to remember. The trouble there is that when we discussed with Peter the subject, he was a bit skeptical because the formal title is on history, patience and reality, the Israeli-Palestinian talks. It didn't seem sexy enough for him, but we tried therefore to do something to do wrong. Why did I start with history? What I want to say to you right now is not something that may be too new to you. There's an history between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. What I'm trying to tell you is the significance of the historic narrative and whether or not it's even possible to overcome it. Because even if I didn't think 2 months ago when we first discussed the possibility of this talk, that it would be a relevant subject, came the implosion of the current talks to bring it back to the historical field. Because look, the current implosion is not about prisoners exchanges. It's not about any other idiotic statement from an Israeli minister about new settlement. At any rate, I'm not going to build, but they are talking about. It is about the fact that somehow the question of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state became a stumbling block. And when the Americans, with all their creativity, didn't find a formula to bridge between the Israelis and the Palestinians, they decided, let's prolong the negotiations. So in order to prolong the negotiations to bring them to the next stalemate, let's find out what we can do now. So they decided to do about prisoners exchange, and so on and so forth. But the real problem is this question of the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, and that brings it to history. I would say, to start with, as a collective of people, the Jewish people in general and the Israelis in particular are the greatest adherents, collectively speaking, of the famous saying by George Santayana, this famous philosopher, if you don't remember history, you are doomed to relive it. I think that it can be agreed that we are the largest per capita nation in the world that really believe in that, even if 99% of us don't even know who said it. History is very significant. But before we come to us, I want to tell you something that you may not have read in your newspapers here, that was said by the Palestinian chief negotiator, Saib Arikat. And before I say what he told, before I tell you what he said, he's a nice guy. I'm telling you, it's not like this, he's a nice guy, but he's a nice guy. Intelligent, bright, man of the world. But then listen to what he said, so that he puts history back on the front table, not on the back burner. He said, the Jews talk about Jerusalem? So somebody said to him, what about the Jewish temple? The Jewish temple was built by King Solomon. So, he was a Muslim. Did you read it? You don't believe me, huh? I know it sounds like a science fiction, huh? Yeah. That's what he said. So now, 2 points before we move on. Do you know of any other conflict in the world where they talk about 3,000 years back? Yeah. Well, by the way, there wasn't a Palestinian people. It is un-Islamic even to say, because Islam is 1,400 years. You know that. So, look. And then, Friday night, the colleagues of Alon Ben David, Channel 2 though, not Channel 10, they interviewed a senior Palestinian spokesperson, Jibril Rajoub. He's an interesting fellow. And they quizzed him about Jerusalem. In the end, even those left-wing Israeli journalists jumped to him and said, tell us once and for all, was there or was there not a Jewish temple in Jerusalem? What was the answer? No. So, why is it so important, therefore, to talk about the historic narrative? It is important because let's start with them, then move on to us. It will be the emphasis of me on what the Jews do and say, not so much on them, but I need to put it in a context, So. And by the way, I noticed that 99% of you did not hear that statement by Arikat. It's very interesting. In Israel, it wasn't just derided. In Israel, it was taken to indicate yet another signal that, what can you do with these people? The historic narrative is important because the two parties say it is important. And when two parties to a conflict agree that history is important, it is important. Tragedy is their histories are totally opposed to each other. They are totally contrasted with each other. And the problem really here is more on their side rather than on our side. But we are not without a fault either, let's face it. The problem is mainly on their side because of something that is very significant, which will then bring us to the current controversy on the Jewish state. It might surprise you what I'm going to say about that. The problem is that in their entire narrative of their national movement, they were the ones who always claimed two things which we have to understand why they said it, what they said and why. A, that there is no Jewish people. No, but that's understandable from their perspective for two reasons. And that's what the problem is, that you can understand why they say something that for you may sound outrageous. And if you want to understand the other side, try to get into their shoes. Try to wear them. Try to find out how they see it. The first reason why they say it is because, according to Islam, the Jews are not a nation. It's a revelation religion. And they say it specifically in number 6 chapter of the Palestinian National Covenant. The Jews are not a nation. It's a religious group as is stated in the Quran. But that's something that Muslims do believe. But then there's another problem, and this is that recognizing the Jews as a nation means if they are a nation, they deserve to have an homeland. Where could they have an homeland? Only one place. You know who said it that will surprise you? And even David Lewis, who sits there, a great expert, and I say meaningfully, Hafiz Assad of all people. The father of the current murderer. On the 24th of January 1987, he gave an interview to a Kuwaiti newspaper called Al-Qabas, which in Arabic means the fire. And he said there, I don't understand those Israelis, so what if they had to stay there 2,000 years ago? Does it give them any rights now? Okay. You know who else said it recently? Fidel Castro, of all people. He gave an interview to Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic. Did you read about this one? Fidel Castro said all kinds of things that he then retracted, but for one that he did not retract. He said, I understand the Israeli security mania. They were in their country 2,000 years ago. They were thrown out. They came back. I understand their security concerns. You have to understand, if the Palestinians accept that there is a Jewish nation deserves self-determination based on territory. That could be only that land. And that they can't accept. They can't accept. It's a problem for them. They can live with it. They can tolerate it. But to accept it in principle, ideologically, that's what the problem is. And I can go on and on, but look, let's talk about history. We are the ones to complain about other people talking about history. We are history-obsessed people, and for all the reasons that we know, but we are. And also our narrative is also therefore dictated by the fact that we understand everything that happens now to be an ongoing continuation of our old history. And we also have a reason for that. Because the Zionist movement is not a movement that started in the late 19th century. The political expression of Zionism surfaced in the late 19th century. But the Zionist movement claims to be an ongoing continuation of Jewish history. And that's what gives it justification. And for good reason, because that's what it is. You don't have any other nation in the world that for 2,000 years are having a day of mourning over the destruction of a whole temple. And I can go on and on like that. You don't have any other nation that when you get married, you break the glass, among other reasons, because you deprecate the destruction of your temple. But the Zionist movement had to do all that. They had to reactivate the sense that there was an ongoing Jewish history that was interrupted for only 2,000 years. And now it's being reasserted. So by definition, we are living back by history. make sense to you, but let's think about it. The very name Zionism is Zion. It goes back. It's a term that was used in the past, not in the late 19th century. So the entire story, therefore, of the two peoples here is by definition contradictory, which then created a unique conflict in the annals of modern history. Because if you try to find out comparable cases, you can find out values that will not be identical. Every conflict has its own, life. But the one that may be close is the Indian-Pakistani conflict, which started in full gear 47-48 over there. Refugee problems, exchange of populations, religious element, and ethnic, but not entirely ethnic, because Punjabis could be Pakistanis and Indians, Hindu and Muslims, so it's religious more than ethnic. But then another war, 65, we had 67, 71, when Bangladesh moved out, 73. But even during those years, in between the wars and after, there were two things that have been characteristic of the Arab-Israeli conflict. One of them is the complete lack of recognition by one party or the other. India and Pakistan have had diplomatic relations in between the wars, and also trade and open borders and all that, as opposed to the boycott of Israel. So, in many respects, this conflict really was so unique in the sense that there was unprecedented situation, even according to international law, whereby you say there is a conflict, but one of the sides has no right even to be there, no right to exist. And that's a problem which they created, and we, of course, reacted. Now you come to the current conflict about the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. Do you really believe that I need a recognition? I don't. So first of all, how it started, and then what it means. I wrote about that, by the way. That's why I brought some papers here. 20 of October 2010, I wrote about it already. Not that I'm a genius, but I wrote. A group of right-wing Likud legislators came to Netanyahu and said, we want to have new law in Israel, applying to Israeli Arabs, nothing to do with the Palestinians, that there should be a pledge of allegiance, like you have every day in your schools and all that, pledge of allegiance. When I was, by the way, at Cornell on sabbatical, my daughter used to say, we had the pledge of malignance today. Since then she improved the religion. She does high-tech like they all do in Tel Aviv. The new religion, really, the secular Israelis. So, we want to inject an element into the Israeli law, a new law that will be an oath of allegiance to the state, that we are pledging allegiance to the Jewish state of Israel. Netanyahu said, hey, it's not so good to have it a law for Israeli Arabs, but we'll make it a demand for the Palestinians from now on. That's how it started. Once it started, you can't remove it anymore. Because then, of course, in terms of politics and the overall identity sense of the Israelis, of course, we are a Jewish state, even though we debate with each other what does it mean to be a Jewish state. But we don't want them to decide for us. So that's how it started. Once you put the goat in the yard, it's there. Because then you can't remove it anymore. How can an Israeli government accept that they would say no? And why would they say no? So here is how it started, but you would then argue that there's an element of manipulation here. Yes, there is. But look, manipulation works when there is a basis. Manipulation works where there is a sense already that is existing, that people say, look, we really don't trust those guys. And now all they need is to have another indication or justification why they don't trust them. So the manipulation can work on the basis of something which is already deep-seated in the minds of people. And therefore, if you ask me now, would I demand 3 years ago, 2 years ago, that the Palestinians recognize the Jewish state of Israel? I would say no. But now I would say yes. Because they say no, how can it be? Sounds stupid? No, it's realistic. That's how politics is. And see what Netanyahu achieved. take, believe me, on this one, absolutely behind him. Yair Lapid. Everybody mistook to be a dovish left-wing, God knows what. He's about taxation and free economy and all the rest of the anti-religious. That's, you know. He said, on this one, I'm behind. 90% of Israeli people would say, we are behind it. And for good reason. Because then they come and say, King Solomon was Muslim. There were not Jewish temple in all it. So history is very, very significant. It's part of the conflict. And by the way, it is not just in the Middle East, but go to the Middle East. That I said maybe before. So Newsweek one day sent a journalist to Baghdad during the surge, 2006, 2007. You know, journalists, when they want to find out what's happening, they go to taxi drivers and barbers. So it's up to one of the taxi drivers, and the guy in Baghdad told him, what are you asking me about Sunnis, Shias? We killed each other for 1400 years, it's just that you found out now. Alawites and Sunnis in Syria, 7 months, 7 years, 7 years, 700 years. From the famous fatwa that the Alawites are worse than all the infidels and deserve death, punishment and all that. When I was the government spokesman in Jerusalem in 1999, I got a guest one day. That's interesting because then I'll make a point out of it. He was a Serbian correspondent of God knows what in Belgrade. He came to see me. I remember his name even, Bora Ardilian. Sounds like an Armenian name to me, but he said he was a Serbian. And he had a little badge here. The badge said 1389, 1989. So I asked him, what's going on? He said, well, you see that you Jews are the only ones who have long history? 600 years ago, we lost to the Ottomans and we lost Kosovo. And this year, we're going to get it back. 600 years ago. Then you go to the mountains of Lebanon, 1985, prior to our final withdrawal from Lebanon. I went to Kaslik. You may know where it is, David. The bastion of ultra-nationalist Maronites. And a group of Israelis, we had kind of farewell meeting with a group of Maronite intellectuals. And there was this famous Maronite intellectual, he died in the meantime, he was already then in his 80s. Little man, slight figure, name was Fadia from, I can't remember the last name. And we talked, everything was nice, you know, they can drink alcoholics, and it was alcoholics, you know. And then in the end he said, and now I have a statement to make to our Israeli friends. The Druze took us away from the Shuf mountains, but we shall come back after 140 years and drive them, never mind how much blood will be spilled. So it is more common in the world that historic conflicts go on and on rather than what you think as Americans. And it is very difficult for you to grasp it, and I'm not patronizing you, I'm not criticizing you. It's your advantage over us, okay? You built a new America, you are opposed to the rest of the world, the old rivalries of the old world. Now you know better. For yourself, not for us. That will bring me soon to the element of patience here. And that's why I injected the word patience. There's some thinking behind it. But beforehand, the American obsession with no history but practicalities and reality. Just 2 examples. You remember the famous writing by Fukuyama after the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of history. Only an American can write the end of history. Obviously, if you have an history of only 250 years, what there's an end to it? It is a little footnote in the history of Jerusalem. A footnote. And he mentioned there, with the fall of the Soviet Union, there will be some small regional conflicts left in the world, Middle East, the Indian subcontinent. Now, again, at that time, the government spokesman in Jerusalem, an Indian delegation, and already at that time, the Indians had good relations with us, even though they denounced us publicly. They still do it now, but the relations are getting better and better all the time. And one of those Indians said to me, did you read this article? I said, yeah. So what do you think about that? I said, oh, it's nonsense. He said, but you know why it's nonsense? We are 1 billion Indians and our conflict is marginal. And then there is the Tahrir Square riots in Cairo. In your Middle East, our good friend Thomas Friedman, who is always wrong, almost always wrong, but he does it brilliantly. wrong in all kinds of ways, but he is brilliantly wrong. Because then you remember what he writes. For example, he wrote to you one time that there cannot be a war between two countries where there is McDonald's in. So because of that, the Russian parliament now decides to throw McDonald's out of Russia. Because you can't deny Thomas Friedman. And now he wrote that Sheldon Adelson is worse to Israel like Khamenei is. Okay, so it's very nice to read it, it's nonsensical, he's wrong. Adelson, okay, you know. I don't debate with casino makers. But I'll tell you this. After Cairo, the riots in Egypt, he basically read his articles. It's the new Middle East, this is a new. The only problem is settlements. But just, you know, why do I make all this? Because, and I'm going to say something that may sound controversial, but before you become angry, listen. Because Americans have no patience. And what really irritates me is that Americans are saying to us, but do something and do quickly. You know what? Generally, I learned the defense minister, who, by the way, was my student, but not because of that he says what he says now. When he said to carry your messianic, he said something very interesting. Because to be messianic sometimes is to believe that, you know, don't rush into anything, things will happen. But sometimes it's the opposite. Do it quickly so that who knows what can happen. And yes, he's right about that. You do not negotiate between Jews and Arabs with a pistol on the head of these people. Like, this is it. After all, you will stay in Washington when the repercussions will be there. And they know better or worse, but they know what's good or bad for them. But the lack of patience on the American side is much more rooted in the overall concept of what conflicts are all about. And we live in a region of the world, whether we like it or not, where conflicts take centuries to resolve. And it's not good, it's bad, it's terrible. So the question is, how do we go beyond history if we want to come into a more mundane territory in which we can talk politics and not just strategy, calculate on the basis of realities rather than just history. So I'll give you an example of how not to do it, and an example how to do it, and then we'll build up on that and move on. How not to do it is for Netanyahu, and it's not because I don't like him or not. I like him, by the way, and I've known him for many years. Because I know him, I like him or don't like him. I've known him for many years personally, and even in a relationship and all this. For him to go and talk about Iran and the nuclear problem in terms of Auschwitzization of the problem, that's wrong. Because if you talk about that in such context, there is no way that Israel would ever come to any other decision than to just destroy the whole thing because we don't want another Auschwitz. That's wrong. And I say to you as somebody who still to this very moment doesn't touch anything German. It's just that they brought me over yesterday with a BMW. What can I do? So it's not about that. It's about how history is becoming so important that to dismiss what he said will be wrong as well. For two reasons. Because if Ahmadinejad says to destroy Israel out of the map of the world, you can't dismiss it. It was said 70 years ago, nobody believed, and see what happened. But to make it a policy is to be obsessed by history. Something has to be in between. You may still come to the point where you will decide on the basis of strategy, on the basis of God knows what consideration that Israel should destroy by itself the Iranian nuclear plant. And I might even support it personally or not, doesn't matter, but I'm saying. But if you start by history, you remove any possibility of a discussion which is other than just this option. Because if it's Auschwitz, you know what you have to do with Auschwitz. Never again we are going to give up to Auschwitz, God forbid. That's right. But is it? So that's an example of how you live by history, turn it into everyday policy, and then become hostage to it. But there are other examples. So the other example is, of course, and that will bring me closer to the Israeli-Palestinian situation, to the last part of this presentation. You go back to Sadat and Begin. You couldn't find two more people who are history-obsessed people than these two. You may not know the record of Anwar Sadat. Anwar Sadat was an Egyptian patriot, devoted Muslim, and pro-Nazi. In the Second World War, he was in jail by the British. Not because of us, because the British were the occupiers of Egypt, and he was against the British. So he had nothing in his biography that educated him, prepared him to be what he ended up being. I even remember that when he came to Jerusalem, some idiot said, did you look at his tie? The tie is composed of many small swastikas put together. Somebody said it, but it was written. Right. Look, stupids are everywhere, you know, and we have quite enough of them. So, you know, and Sadat he was the spokesperson of Nasser, which I mentioned in my previous talk. They called him in Arabic, Big Bashi, Sahsah, the lieutenant colonel who says yes all the time. He was like, whatever Nasser said, Sadat, look, yeah. So it was Israel's enemy. And in 1972, a year before the Yom Kippur War, he said, if it takes 1 million Egyptians to sacrifice for the liberation of the Suez Canal, I'll do that. And he did what he did, and then he came to Jerusalem. We'll come back to it. Menachem Begin. Well, I grew up in the Begin movement, in the Beitar movement, so it's, you know, it's no secret. I mean, for us, the belief in Greater Israel was our secular religion. Because it was clear and obvious that Zionism cannot be restricted in Tel Aviv and not in Beit El or Hebron or Shiloh or Anatot. It's the same country. Well, we'll come to that as well. And Menachem Begin was the prophet of all that. After, of course, the great guy, the great teacher, the Buddhist, but he was, you know. So when they two meet and they are deciding on what they did, they were history-obsessed people. And how do we know it? Listen to the text of their speeches in the Knesset. These were the two most classic speeches that you could hear from real, genuine, national, authentic, genuine national leaders. But what did they do? They did something very important, which will be the basis of my next and one before last point. They accepted the justification, the validity of their national narratives, but they said exactly because we accept it, we are ready to give up on the complete fulfillment of it because we came to the conclusion that something else is important and we need to make peace, otherwise we are both suffering. So history could be therefore a positive element if you accept a narrative, you believe in it, but then you say, I also have to go through the pain of making concessions because there is something else. There is something else. And that leads me to an interim point before the bigger one. When I look at the situation of Israel today, I would say to you something that some of you may find controversial. People, never mind if they call themselves Zionists or not, if they do not believe that for Israel to renounce even one iota of land in our historic homeland, if they think that this is not a concession, they cannot be partners for a peace process. In order to be a partner for a peace process, you need to feel the pain of giving up something which is important to you. Because only when you feel the pain of giving up, you show the strength of your feeling that peace is important. For this or that reason. You need to believe in that. You need to feel the pain of that. You can't say Jerusalem is not ours. And let's divide Jerusalem. You need to say Jerusalem has always been ours. Mentioned in the Bible, you know how many times? 2,284 times. You know how many times in the Quran? Zilch, nothing. You know that already in 1850 there were more Jews than Christians and Muslims in Jerusalem? So now you know. And so on and so forth. But you need to decide on an overall basket of priorities that cannot be removed from what you believe to be your rights. Because if you don't believe these are your rights, what are you doing there? You don't give up, the other side will never respect it. Therefore, all those leftists, whether they call themselves Zionists or not, will say, it's not ours, let's get away from it. They can't make peace. You need to make peace by convincing those who believe in your rights. Those who don't believe in your rights, they will give up it anyway. And that brings me, therefore, to what, from my perspective, okay, could be done now about 3 controversial issues, so that I won't leave you with just theories. First of all, about Jerusalem. But I must tell you before that, it is really a complete historic injustice for anyone to suggest that the Jews should give up in Jerusalem. It is injustice, but it is been an injustice for 2,000 years. And there are things that have happened to us as a nation and still happen to us that we are not powerful and strong enough to overturn. And when you have a big wave sometimes, you lower the head so that you can move on later on and then raise the head again. And the world is hypocritical about Jerusalem. The only time when there was no freedom of expression, freedom of worship in Jerusalem was from 49 to 67, when we were prevented from being there. Not when they were. They were under illegal Judean occupation. I agree with all that. But without an agreement on Jerusalem, there will not be peace with the Palestinians, and I want peace with them. Why? Because I think that it will be the best for Israel to be in peace with them, if it's possible. If it is possible. So, Jerusalem, there are 4 Jerusalems. And here is. One Jerusalem is the old West Jerusalem until 67. There's no debate about that. It was Israel, Israel. The other one is the old city, where they say there was no Jewish temple. Now, can we say there are no mosques? They're there. By the way, interesting story to you. One time I was at George Mason University in Washington to get some kind of a reward there, award, because they gave it a week earlier to Hanan Ashrawi, old friend. Old friend of mine who debated on television. Interesting woman. She doesn't like us though, but she's interesting. And there was a group of Palestinian students, and one of them I found out later was her daughter. And I talked and I mentioned Jerusalem, and she asked me the question, which is very educational, very important. She said to me, but Dr. Olmert, you said that Jerusalem is so important to you, and yet you are ready for concessions there, so it can't be important to you. Because if it's important to you, you can't give up on that. We should never give up. If you give up, it's not yours. So, what I'm trying to tell you is you need to believe in your rights, and on the basis of that to still say, but you know what, I'm ready to give up on the fulfillment of all my rights so that I can move on to do something else. But you need to understand it, you need to agree with it. So one Jerusalem is West Jerusalem, the old city. The third Jerusalem is the east city around the old city. The fourth one are the outlying districts that were annexed to Jerusalem by our government after the 6 Days War. And then the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem were extended. The problem is that, as it happened always, what was almost empty in 67 became full with Arabs later on. So there's, for example, a place called Walasha. Walasha is near Bethlehem. During the British Mandate, it was 400 or 500 people. Now there are 12,000 people. You ask me, it's not Jerusalem. So you have 4 different parts of Jerusalem. You can create 4 different statuses of control and still find a one joint umbrella that will keep a unity of the city, even though with different political statuses. And of course, one thing that I will never give up on is to give a majority in the administration of the old city to the Muslim side. That can be. But you can find an arrangement which is based on, I would call it multi-status arrangement. The second question is about settlements. Now, I will never agree that Jews have no right to be in Bethlehem, Judea, but they can be in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. There are some Jews there, that survive the steel and the coal industry. Lehigh Valley, The settlers movement won a big historic victory because of two reasons. A, because they established the right of Jews to live everywhere in the land of Israel. This is something that for me was very important. I'm talking now. They also achieved another victory, and this is that any arrangement which is likely to happen, which is realistic even in a very remote way, cannot include removal of all the Jews from these territories. And why should it be? We saw what happened in Gaza. Settlements have never been the stumbling block for anything. We removed all the settlements from Gaza. What happened there? 2 wars. Only 2 wars. Maybe there will be another one. Hopefully not. However, from a nationalistic perspective, as I understand it, as a graduate of the Beitar movement, the revisionist movement, all this tradition of Greater Israel, but the secular branch of it, I would say, look, those who really believe in Jewish nationalism, those who really believe in Zionism, need to understand that at the current historic stage, the priority of the Jewish state should not be on having 50,000 more Jews on top of the already that they are there. It should be on other areas. I will therefore not wait. I will not wait for pressures to freeze the construction of new settlements. I will do it by myself because it's my interest. And then 2 things can happen. And I'm not sure that I know what will happen. One of them will be that nothing will happen. So you prove another point that they don't talk about real peace, they talk about settlements, and you can always rebuild them later on. Or that indeed that will ignite something. So what's wrong about that? We'll see. But look, all these talks all the time of this housing minister and others will be here, will be there, will be there, will be there, and they don't do anything about it, just talk about it. It's not helpful. Not helpful. But then I will say to the Palestinians the following. 20% of Israeli citizens are Arabs. Why can't there be Jews living also in a state that might be still dominated by Arabs with special arrangements? That's the real apartheid. Don't you say the Jews cannot stay there? They are the ones who institute the real apartheid. And I want Abbas to explain why Jews cannot live among Arabs. He will say, I'm sure, look how nice the Maronites live with the Sunnis in Lebanon. Look how nice the Alawites live with the Sunnis in Syria. Look how nice they all live with each other. So yeah, the Jews could live with us. Of course he will not say. But okay, why do we have to play by the game that says that Jews have no right to live in those territories? How can we give an end to something like that? But living there is not necessarily taking control of it. But can I say to Jews, you have no right to live in Hebron? How can one normal Jewish person say to Jews, you have no right to live in Hebron? I mean, that's the birthplace of our nation. You can't say it. But to make it the stumbling block when there are so many more Arabs in Hebron as opposed to Jews, I mean, we need to prioritize ourselves. The third point would be about refugees. Look, finally, for the first time, the Americans recognized through an interview by Martin Indyk, I don't know what he thinks now, but a month ago he said that there has to be recognition of the problem of Jewish refugees as comparable to, he didn't use the word comparable. In 2002, professor from the Technion, Ada Roni Shi, compiled a very decisive, interesting research about the exodus of Jews from Arab countries. You know, that the right of return there's no right of return. As a collective group of people, only Jews have the right of return to their own land. But if there is a recognition of the compatibility of the problem, Jews left, Arabs left for this or that reason, call it as you wish, and you solve it in this context in terms of compensation and all that, you can also have arrangements about reunification, humanitarian cases, and all that comes with it, that may change here or there. You can do something like that. You can do it. So what I'm trying to say is, all these three issues, particularly the first one about Jerusalem, require something that is to go beyond historic narratives. Now, it's easier said than done. Do we have a majority in Israel today? I'm not sure. I can tell you as a former member of the Likud party, I mean, most of my life, the DNA of the Likud party is against doing it. And why not? I mean, this is the party that grew up on the idea of greater Israel and all that, you know, and then they now say to Netanyahu, they hold him in a very unpleasant place in Israel, you can do this, you can do that, as you learned from Alon Ben Zavid. It's not so simple. And even if you want to have another coalition government, who knows if you can have it, go to elections, you never know what the results will be. But the real test of leadership would be to say exactly that to the Israeli people and then to the rest of the world. But to emphasize all these points cannot take place until there is something happening also on the other side which leads to this. And quite frankly, even if I didn't think that Netanyahu had to raise this issue of the Jewish state in the first place, now that I hear all this bullshit, pardon me for using the word, should I say it? No. Even if when I hear all these nonsensical statements about King Solomon and all that, I mean, where is the other side of it? And there is one weakness, that will be my point before very last, this is it. Here is one weakness of any of those events and any of those seminars, which is not the weakness of the organizers. They are best. Meldic family and all the rest. I don't want to mention names because if I forget what, it is that if we debate it between ourselves, we somehow will end up living out of the room, thinking to ourselves, it's only about what Israel should do, what Israel should not do. It's always about the other side as well. And you know when there will be peace? If somebody from the other side will come and say, yes, we have the rights for the entire land, but we are ready to give the application of this right. So we don't give up the narrative, we give up the complete application of the narrative. That's not the same. Can there be somebody who says it? You know what, I want to end up for a change. I'm not a nice guy usually, but I want to leave you with a nice feeling. Start working again tomorrow in full week. There's a guy called Muniv al-Masri. The name is very interesting, means Muniv the Egyptian, but he calls himself a Palestinian. There are thousands upon thousands of Arabs who call themselves Masarwa and Masri. They are basically Egyptians, but they are now in Palestine. So they are good Palestinians and we don't belong there. Okay. He is the biggest millionaire in the Palestinian territories. When I came here yesterday, I read an article that he wrote in Arabic, somebody interpreted to Hebrew on his behalf, saying, yes, we accept the fact that the Jews have some connection to the land. Okay, you know what? It's something. So all that I came here to tell you is that we have some connection to the land. Thank you very much.
Before I open up the floor to Q&A, and I'll try to make this louder this time. I was told it was much too soft this morning. I just want to remind you all that after the session, we also have wonderful breakout panels and a breakout session to look forward to. Michael Leitner's session on coexistence projects in soccer, and a panel discussion on Israel boundaries to the conversation, ? Dr. Olmert and I will discuss the importance of having that conversation over drinks later on. I want to ask you the first question, however, and then I'm going to do my best to call on the room Catholically, you'll pardon the expression. I did, and I must have an adjective there, but my mistake. Rabbi Arthur Goshafer, one of the many wonderful rabbis in this community, has a saying that he's very fond of, which is that an enemy is someone whose story we have not yet heard. And what I've heard you talking about the importance of knowing what we're giving up and recognizing it, and you wish the other side could encompass that we're giving up something. The flip side of that is, what can we do to recognize what the other side is giving up that hurts?
Well, it's a great question, but sorry. It's a great question, but it is, again, it's to the point before I concluded my talk. Don't ask me what they should feel about. I'm not a spokesman. You know, and I'm saying it now, something that some of you may find unpleasant. I used to say, when I wake up in the morning, I never ask myself the question, what did I do wrong to the Palestinians last night? I ask myself another question, what can they do good to the Jewish people today? And no, I'll tell you why I say it. There is enough people who would argue that case. What I said here is that I know they have a case. They can argue it. And by saying that there should be all those concessions, I basically accept the idea that the narrative cannot be totally fulfilled. Therefore, their narrative will be partly fulfilled as well as mine. So this is my answer to you, but beyond that, I'm not the right person to do that. And I don't claim to be, no, I'm not reprimanding you for it. I'm saying, I'm on that side.
But suppose,
I'm not neutral.
But suppose
I'm on the side of Israel. You'll be surprised to hear that.
Dr. Olmert, suppose you have a choice between standing across the room from one Palestinian who, when you say, this is what I'm giving up, and it hurts, and they say, I don't care, this is what we're giving up, and it hurts. Don't want to talk about what you're giving up. Or a Palestinian who says, I hear that. I understand because I have family who left Lydia in 1948 and will never come back, and I know that I have to give that one up too, and it hurts. Can we hear each other on that?
Yeah,
which is better?
You definitely can. I mean, the second one will be better, but the basis of the discussion should be that it should be part of achieving peace, of search for peace, you know. Look, I don't know, I think that Yanni, right? I mean, your introduction of me was, and you mentioned the fact that I have Arab and Palestinian friends. Look, I think that I even have friends in Syria. Don't ask me what they are now, who knows if they're still alive, you know. The point I'm trying to make to you is I'm really trying to talk. And I'm really trying to reach out. But I always say to them, look, I am a die-hard, dedicated Zionist. To the last day of my life, I will be a Zionist. And I don't expect you not to be Palestinian nationalist. But let's see whether we can achieve something. And you know what? It's easier for me, as I find it out, to say this than for them to say the opposite. But when I said what I said about this Palestinian millionaire, and I sounded a bit cynical, well, maybe that is the beginning of the response from Abu Mazen through this millionaire, because he's very close to him. He's trying to find out the formula to bridge up the gaps. We'll see. I don't know. We'll see.
Let me turn this over to the room now. I'm going to start off with Michael Leitner, who's going to be giving a panel discussion shortly.
It was a great talk. I appreciate it. I'd like you to comment on something we talked about this morning.
By the way, ask me about soccer. I'm a soccer fanatic. If you give me your card later on, I'll surprise you. I wrote 2 pieces exactly about that subject.
Love for you to talk
I'm a
about
supporter of Beitar Yerushalayim Football Club, which is the most racist club in Israel. This is the Likud voters, you know. They don't like any Arab playing there, and God forbid what happens if an Arab player in the stadium from the other team. That's very bad.
A question was asked this morning: what can we do to make Israel standing in the world better, to ward off the divestment campaign, the delegitimization of Israel? And it was suggested that well, Israel should really show that it's willing to compromise to end the occupation. And I want you to comment on that, because it seems that Ehud Barak reached very far, your brother reached very far, and it doesn't seem like we did gain much credit in the world for that.
Look, that's a great question. First of all, when the lady from the embassy, I remember, she said it, Dana, her name, when she said that the BDS is anti-Semitic, I think that one of I believe, it is anti-Semitic. And by the way, I could use this example as part of the narrative, because when you talk to Jews about boycott, this is what Jews understand from it. 1st of April 1932, the boycott of Jews in Germany. 10th of May 1933, the burning of the books. September of 35, Nuremberg laws. November of 38, Kristallnacht. And I wrote a piece about that, quoting from Pastor Martin Niemöller, you know, the famous When they did this, I said, no, that's how boycotts start, and you never know how they end, and singling out Israel is anti-Semitism pure and simple. There's a moron from the University of California, San Diego, not San Diego State University. He is the president of the ASA, that boycott Israel, the American Studies Association. And he was asked, there's so much happening in the Middle East, why would you do something like this to Israel? You know what he said? Word by word. You have to start somewhere. This is what it is. You always start with the Jews. And that's anti-Semitism. I'm not debating with you. Coming back now to your question, look. First of all, I spent 20 years of my life on Asbara. I was the chief masbir for years. You know, because there is so much anti-Semitism, also Asbara is limited in its effect. And the right wing in Israel have to understand once and for all. If you believe that everybody is anti-Semitic, you can't convince them. But then they say, more Asbara, more Asbara. So Asbara is a tool of policy. It's not a policy. Asbara is a tool. Explaining, PR, it's a tool. And the question is, what policies you enact? I would argue to you that what we have to do, on top of what the diplomat said, and she gave a great talk, we, exactly because I'm a nationalist Jew, exactly because my historic outlook of the world is that yes, they don't like us. Yes, we are, you know, isolated. You know, the nation on its own and all this. But what can we do about it? Because we can't fight it sometimes. You can't beat and join them. And pick up your fights. Pick up your priorities. Pick up your decisions on what is more or less important to you. And today, in the world of today, to be concrete, if I have to choose my ideas now, I will go after the Jewish state, even though it wasn't from the beginning my baby, but okay, now it's, you know. I would go after security issues, the Jordan Valley, and all that, you know. By the way, what the defense minister is after, General Yalon. That's his shtick. I will not go after settlements. I will give up on the struggle to build new settlements and all that. This is causing us damage because this is too simple for those who really want to use it against us. Is it hypocritical on their part? Yes. Can we change the entire world all the time and fight against everybody all the time? No. So we need to pick up our fights. Therefore, Asbara should be a tool of the policy, but not the policy itself. And when Netanyahu talks about, oh, they didn't attack Auschwitz in the Second World War, so God knows what can happen now with Iran. That is when you subject policy to Asbara. That's the other way around. You have to do it the other way around. So I don't know if it satisfies you, but it gives you a sense of where my thinking is. Pick up the fights and do it on issues that you stand a good chance of convincing other people. Knowing that they don't necessarily like us, to say it very, very mildly. Do I surprise you?
Can I bring the microphone around from the back to almost the front?
Picking up on the thread about giving something up, what would you want to hear from the Palestinians that they would give up? And what would you say to them? What do you think they would want to hear from you that you would, two things?
What they want to hear from me, what I would say, I said, you know, what I would like to hear from them. I would like to hear from them that the conflict with the Palestinians is going to be resolved once and for all without any more claims once there is a peace treaty with Israel. That's one of the reasons why the insistence on the Jewish state is right, because then it stems their future demands, you know. I would like to hear from them that they are ready to consider the possibility of having Jews living under them, under special this or special that, as much as there are Arabs in Israel. I would expect them to understand that the administration of the holy places in Jerusalem could not be in their hands only, God forbid. I would like to hear all kinds of things from them. And you know what? Why not? I would even add up 15 other demands. The more goats you put in the yard, then you have more to take out. You can play with it. But I would definitely come up with demands. And you know why? Exactly because of what I said during my talk. You need to believe in your case in order to be able to give up. But if you don't believe in your case, it's not a giving up. It's not yours, you just give away. And giving away is not giving up.
Okay, I'm going over to David.
I appreciate you talking about historical narrative. I've spent way too much time with Shiites talking about what Sunnis did to them in Karbala when Ali was slaughtered in 1,000 years ago.
680, I tell you exactly.
And I spent a lot of time with Serbs talking about the Battle of Kosovo Polje in Kosovo. But there's a question I've never been able to answer, and I'm hoping you can answer it. When does history begin?
When you decide it. History starts whenever you decide it. It's up to you to decide. That's exactly the point that Arekat did and that I laughed at. If he thinks that history started with King Solomon, it is the problem, but that's what he thinks. But it's a problem. He decides when his history starts, and I decide when mine starts. And by the way, you know the Maronites in Lebanon, you know the famous saying by Dubai, the 16th century, I mean the 7th century, the Maronites like a little island surrounded by a big ocean and all that. In the Middle East, we always look back hundreds of years and all that, and we are not an exception here. And, okay, maybe beyond your question, David, but here is the problem. I'm losing points when I try to say to other people, because it always sounds like here is a smart cookie, somebody who pretends to be clever, who tries to convince me, but in the end of the day, all he says is, there's not going to be any peace. So therefore, I said in the end, what would be my own concessions in order to show them that I can move on from one to another. But the fact of the matter is, if you look back at the conflict with the Palestinians being only a century and plus, in the history of the Middle East, we are a very young conflict. We are not even like graduation age. No, you agree with me, no? Yeah. But no, tell me, you are from East Lebanese, I mean, we just pretend to be. So, that's what I do to some of my students. I don't, look, you are a student. When you come from Lebanon, are you coming with history on the side, or are you coming with history in the very forefront of whatever you hear from people?
I'd like to give everyone their, I'd like to wipe their brains of history, because I think history is what is a huge problem. And then people are trapped by their historical narrative.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said.
Often the concept is that history is being used as a weapon. So you're weaponizing history as the attack.
I use the word manipulation. Yeah, okay,
Next question.
So speaking about these historical issues, you mentioned that it takes several hundred years to resolve a conflict in the Middle East, but accepting those cases where one of the parties disappeared, have any of the conflicts in the Middle East ever been resolved?
I would argue to you, and again, I mean, it's not like I'm inviting you to invite me again if you don't love to come. I will argue to you that to a large extent the Arab-Israeli conflict is resolved. With Egypt having peace with us, with Jordan having peace with us, with Syria being dismembered into God knows how many little states, whether it's our doing or not, to a large extent, and Alon said it before, it's being resolved in a sense that it is no more what it used to be. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict now is not yet resolved. I would use the term Arab-Palestinian-Israeli conflict because I always want to show that it is always part of a bigger problem, but in terms of the reality, this is what it is, so look. Maybe it's not going to be resolved. Right. And you know what, I'll tell you something about it. And this is now back to our politics in Israel, but not politics, the way we understand Zionism. There are people who say that if there is not going to be peace, Zionism failed. Which I totally reject, because Zionism is a national liberation ideology that stands on its own feet. It doesn't condition itself on others doing this or that or us. It conditions itself on the natural right of the Jewish people for self-determination in its own homeland. So I would still be a total diehard Zionist even if the conflict is not resolved. Why do I want it to be resolved? I want it to be resolved because I believe that with the current, and as I can foresee the future configuration of situations, it will be better for Israel to do that. And I do want to resolve it only for this reason. What's better for Israel? What's better for our people, for my people? And look, I want to say something else that I should have said before, so bear with me if I have this 2 minutes. I want to talk again about the question of swap of prisoners. Look, there is a problem here, and it's a very interesting problem. Take a guy like, and I'll make a point here. Take a guy like Lieberman, the foreign minister. He's a very clever person, whether we like his ideologies or not. He's a very, very shrewd and astute politician. He is ready to give neighborhoods in Jerusalem up because he wants to create an ethnic separation between Jews and Arabs. He even is ready to give up the lands of Israel pre-67. I don't know if you're aware of it. Not to transfer the people from there, to give it up to a Palestinian state in order to maintain some of the settlement blocks in Israel, so that Jews will be under Israel, Arabs under. So that shows that in a way he's still nationalist and right-winger because he thinks in nationalist terms, but he's ready for compromises. A few hours ago I read a statement he made. Over the prisoners' exchanges, I will ready to break up the government and go to new elections. Never to give up on that. And you say to yourself, it doesn't make logic. It's not logical. You are ready to give up land, but not to give up some bastard, some murderer, you know. Here is the point. And that comes again to narrative of history, in a way, but I may be overstretching it. For many Israelis, beyond the emotional element connected with giving up on people that really did heinous crimes. I mean, let's face it, and you heard a description before from Malone about the Moses family, there could be so many other cases. The sense is that any give up on the part of Israel, any concession is a sign of weakness which brings us back to our old history, where we were the ones to give up all the time. If you are powerful, you can give up. Only when you are weak, you don't want to give up, because then you believe that they will see that you are weaker. I don't think that giving up on the question of prisoners is anything to do with anything beyond that. On the overall configuration of things on the plate, what is to do, what is not to do, this is the one I would do before I would give up on land or I would give up in Jerusalem, what would be. Just give them back some murderers. Give them back some other idiots. There are so many of them. Why do you need them? You know, give them back. But I'm telling you, and look, I started defense minister whom I admire to this very day, Professor Ar, he's an American Jew originally, so that's your problem, you see. It's almost American Jews. I mean, it's all from you. It's all the troubles from you. Look, and so many settlers are. Oh, they will not invite me again, I understand. But look, I always had this debate with him, if I can share it with you, that he always believed, and this is what history is so important, he always believed that whenever something bad happens to Israel, if we don't immediately react, it's weakness. It's like we used to be. We are not in Israel again to behave like we used to. Sometimes you give up, sometimes you don't give up, sometimes you do this, sometimes you do that, and all of it is in the context of feeling confidence. And what is an example of that? Remember the first Gulf War when the Iraqi Scots were falling on Israel? Remember the 42 Scots? Only one person was killed out of heart attack. I remember his name, Eitan Grunland. He became a legendary figure because the only one who was killed, but out of heart attack. And Aaron said to Shamir, who was my boss at the time, we need to retaliate. Israeli generals thought, what are you talking about? The American Air Force is bombing Baghdad like crazy. Saddam Hussein will not even know that any more bombs come from Israel. I mean, you know. And then came Lawrence Eagleberger, who was at that time the Deputy Secretary of State. He died in the meantime. The big guy was assistant of Kissinger, you know, in the old days. He was very pro-Israel. And he sat down with Shamir. And everybody made fun of Shamir. He was a great prime minister. And Shamir gave him a list of 12 demands. Eagleberger said, yes, 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 yes. I would argue to you that was much more important to Israel than retaliating by sending our pilots to Baghdad to feel good that they killed some Iraqis there. So strength, therefore, is measured in all kinds of ways. And sometimes by not doing things, you show yourself to be stronger than by doing things only because you want to show that you are strong.
So we have only 4 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is have 2 people or 3 people ask questions, so you can choose how you want to answer them with the time remaining. So first, a few questions.
Hi. So at UCSB, this will be the second year that we've had to deal with the issue of BDS and divestment on our campus. And I actually asked a similar question to Ari Shavit a little while ago, but because I think our generation and on campus, we've sort of lost the historical narrative of the creation of Israel and on both sides. I'm wondering if you have any advice or how you'd argue against BDS and how Israel can keep its moral high ground.
I would not invite myself to come again only for that sake, although it would be a pleasure. It's a good, big question. Look, first of all, what do you mean we lost the historic narrative? We never even used it in our debates. We never used it. We didn't lose anything that we didn't even try to fight for. But that's not a criticism of you. It's just a realization of the problem. Look, Norman Finkelstein, you know this self-hating Jew? Well, the guy that is anti-Israel, he talks that Israel is worse than the Nazis and all that, so that's self-hating Jew. He all of a sudden had an enlightenment over a year ago, 2 years ago. If you leave me your card, I can provide you with materials in between and all that to help you guys. He said to the BDS people, hey guys, let's stop that nonsense. You don't want to have Israel in existence. That's the truth. So say the truth. Don't talk about boycott this, boycott that. You don't want to have Israel around. So that's what happens. But look, the question of BDS can be tackled from a variety of perspectives. And the real question here is tactical before it's strategic. You are here, you are the students, and you know what the turf is. I don't know what the turf is. No. If the idea is that there is going to be a vote by whatever body, I don't know, you know, and the idea is to win a vote, all you need to do is, and that's all, it means a lot, is to decide who are the voters and what will be the best to tell them specifically, never mind the historic narrative. Just tell them what could convince them. I don't know who is going to vote, the students' council, the overall students' body, faculty, I don't know, I'm asking. Because I'm looking at it as a two-tier battle. The immediate battle in a particular place, and therefore I go always after the particular condition. Because if there was BDS at the University of South Carolina, where I teach, trust me, it would have been defeated 1 to 99. Because it's another turf. Here it's, you know, I don't know who are the people that vote. Minorities or this or that, how many Jews, how many evangelicals. We need to know all that. On a tactical level, that's what I will tell you, and of course it's not the substance, it's the tactics. On the strategic level, I would always advise you prepare for the next battle, because even if you lose this one, go for the other one. But don't shy away from the battle. That's what we have done for too many years in campuses, that's why we are losing.
We have time for one
So
last
you
question.
say now that we lost the historic narrative, whereas we are so right historically, and I don't blame you, because many Jews for many years, and I heard it, they said, look, you know what makes me feel good today? That nobody talked anything about Israel. And I keep saying to them, why is it so good for you? I wanted to talk about Israel. They found something good for agriculture. They did something good about the rights of LGBT. They did this, they did that. Don't shy away from all that. But no. The less we talk about Israel, the better. So we became pariahs by our own making.
So we're going to have to end at that point. And I want to thank you.
Pariahs, no!
We're going to have to end at that point because my boss tells me to stop and I will listen to my president.